Hello everyone, welcome to the third video. Today I'll be covering look dev as well as hair grooming. I'll also be doing some lighting. Right now I'm setting up the camera, making sure the character is centered. I eventually end up using a camera and aim, but right now I'm showing the normal camera. Also tweaking some of the frames, changing the output to EXR, changing the resolution. I eventually go with a 1080p, but right now, just for testing, I'm keeping it to the size of the character. Now I'm creating a dome light, which will carry the HDRI image. I plug this into the dome text, and make sure it's raw. Then I go ahead and start V-Ray in the viewport. It's the V button on top of the viewport window. This lets me have a lot of interactivity, and I can also move around in that viewport and it will still be rendering with V-Ray. I also use the V-Ray light editor, which lets me see all the lights in the scene. And I can also tweak the amount of intensity. I can also tweak the color. So right now I'm setting up a backdrop. It's basically a large sphere that I flatten at the bottom, and then I snap to the floor. So that way I can have a seamless backdrop in all directions, wherever the camera is. Now the V-Ray RT in the viewport likes to display bounding box, so I go and change it to wireframe in the settings, so I'm able to see the wireframe whenever I select an object in the render. Now make sure the backdrop does not cast shadow. It only receives shadow. That way it doesn't cast a shadow on the character and make her darker than the actual textures. Now go ahead and create a direct light. It's an area light. And make sure it's invisible so I don't see in the scene. Now it's time to tweak the lighting. Now lighting is usually a trial and error thing, and it's very time consuming, and you'll see me tweak it a lot. Here I toggled the target, which is a button under the V-Ray light, and it lets me have a target manipulator, and then I can move that anywhere, and then the light will be able to sort of pivot around it. Now for the material and the displacement of the skin, I'm going to use the XYZ displacement tool, which takes the displacement from ZBrush and the displacement from Mari and Substance Painter, and then it combines them. It creates the nodes automatically for me, so I don't have to set them up, but it's basically blending between them. Now I test to see if the displacement is working. It seems to be coming in. Now I'm going to tweak the amount of the texture XYZ, which is the skin pores, because if you remember I had 3 channels for XYZ, and they basically had different levels of detail from the texturing XYZ resource I've used, so that way I'll be able to dial in different intensities. Here you can see I brought in the color map as well and the glossiness, and I make sure the gloss and the displacement are set to raw, and then the reflection and the diffuse are set to sRGB. Any displayable color needs to be set to sRGB. Now making shader for the eyeballs, for the inner eyeballs. I'm just gonna make it dark for now. Eventually I'll come back to it. Now for the gloss, I'm connecting it to a remap HSV node, which lets me tweak the intensity, and I can play with the values and the levels to get different gloss levels. Also I make 3 HSV nodes like you see here, and I connect the diffuse color to them. This lets me use the diffuse map as the SSS color. Usually you'd have those be completely different maps, 3 different maps, but I am just using the same one here for this character, and I'm coloring each of them differently. So I'm making the shallow map, which is the first level of skin, desaturated, and then the mid map is just basically the diffuse color as it is, and then the last map, the deep map, is a very saturated, much redder version of the diffuse color map. That way you'll be able to control 3 different levels of skin. I'm connecting all this to the V-Ray AL surface material. I also go ahead here and connect the displacement map, because I had disconnected it earlier just for speed, just to judge the color, but now I'm combining them together, showing displacement and the color and the gloss. I realized the subdivisions were too high, so I dropped them from 6 to 5, which was good enough. And now you can see the skin pore and the ZBrush displacement rendered together and the color map. So now I connect back the gloss map and the specular map, which only controls specular intensity. I'm also able to change the values with the HSV color correct node before I connect it to the shader. That way I can change the intensity or the contrast. Also, this shader is using roughness actually, and I had made a gloss map because I last minute decided to use a different shader. So here I'm using a reverse node to invert the values before I connect it to the shader. Now I'm making a background layer so I can disable the environment so it renders faster without the gradient in the background. This is a layer so I can turn it off and on whenever. Now just now I had made a cloth displacement material, and now I'm connecting the same diffuse map from earlier because it's the UDIM sequence. I made sure to set up the UV tiling mode to UDIM Mari, and I did this on all the texture nodes. Now with the detail, gloss, and color map connected to the cloth, now I select all the parts that need displacement, and I go to the V-Ray shelf and I click assign a displacement node to multiple objects, one displacement node to multiple objects. Now in the top right in the attribute editor, I'm going to attributes, V-Ray extra attributes, and I'm adding the subdivision, displacement control, and subdivision displacement quality. And in those settings, I'm changing the subdivision amount and turning off subdivide UVs and turning off any kind of filtering. As you see here, you're getting some very weird glitches, and this happens due to the UDIM sequence. It's a Maya glitch that has to do with the 32-bit displacement and how it works with UDIM for displacement. So as you're seeing here, I turned the displacement bounds from automatic to explicit, and now enter -5 for the min and +5 for the max, and make sure to do this in the RGB 0 to 1 mode in the color picker. And yeah, that fixes it right up. So you don't have to assign one displacement map per object. You can still use UDIM and 32-bit displacement as long as you do that. Right there you see I'm entering the minimum and maximum value, the min and max, in the explicit mode, and that fixes the displacement. This of course only applies to 32-bit displacement when it's in the UDIM mode. Now I'm checking the displacement intensity for the detail that's coming from the texture XYZ maps. And then I'm tweaking them. Throughout the process, I'm actually tweaking them a lot of times. This of course affects the gloss level, because the more detail you have on the surface, the less glossy it becomes. So it's kind of a balancing act between the displacement and the gloss map. Now right here I use the HSV and the diffuse map to make it a little bit brighter because it was kind of getting a little bit too dark. Now for the inner eye shader, I grabbed the maps from the texture shelf. It's a tab in the Hypershade, because I don't want to import these textures again. They already live in the scene and they're referencing the UDIM file sequence. So it's just one texture node to control everything basically. For diffuse, for gloss, each of them get one texture node. So you don't have to have hundreds of files. That's the best thing about the UDIM workflow. And now as you see, I plugged in the gloss map and the diffuse map, although I ended up scrapping the gloss map because I only kept gloss on the outer eye mesh. And just now I tweaked the refraction value of that outer shader to be 1.337, which gives you that eyeball refraction inside view. And it closes the gap. So that gap we had between the two meshes, now it's completely blocked. I'm also playing with the HSV color correct node for the diffuse for the eyes, making sure the whites of the eyes aren't too bright, and also turn off cast shadow on the outer eye mesh so it doesn't affect the brightness. And then of course I would have to tweak the inside of the eyeballs again. And yeah, as you can see right there, the gap we had before between two meshes are not visible anymore because the refraction closes that and it makes it look very natural. Now for the metals, I selected all the metals in the scene, and a V-Ray shader should be enough for this. So I didn't use the AL surface, I'm just using a V-Ray MTL. I connect the same texture nodes, the UDIM texture nodes I've set up before, to control the entire scene. And now I connect the IOR map, and you make sure to turn off the lock for now IOR, and then once you unlock that, then it will let you plug in a map there. And now in V-Ray Next, which is what I'm using here, allows you to use the metalness workflow, so you can also use metalness roughness. I use that sometimes too. So in Substance Painter, you wouldn't have to convert when you're exporting, which is really nice in the new V-Ray. You can just take metalness and roughness. Now with the metals material selected, I go to edit and then duplicate with connections to network, and that keeps the connections from the textures, although it duplicates the shader. So now I have two shaders sharing the same files. It's really fast to basically split the material that way. And I've done that in this case to give the gemstone its own shader. Then I tweak the refraction and the normal map amount because I think it was a little bit too intense. I can dial it in just to give it a little bit of interest. Just a little bit of detail to give it some interest. Now I do the mouth meshes, the tongue, teeth, and gums. I give them a V-Ray AL surface, subsurface material. And then I connect the traditional textures to it. Now for some of these meshes, I need to put them in sub D, which is smooth. So I use a displacement node. And then instead of adding displacement attributes to it, I add a open subdiv attribute, which lets me choose the amount of subdivisions that happen at render time. So I don't actually have it set to smooth in the viewport, like when you hit 3. It only happens when you render, so that way the viewport can stay light. A quick shader for the temporary hair. More color, saturation, and value tweaking. Also the gloss. Some more light tweaking. Oh, by the way, earlier I had changed the shape type for the light to disk, so it appears around in the highlights of the eyes. The more light changes. Always good to have the V-Ray light editor open, so you can turn off lights really quickly, change their colors and intensity. Trying to get an appealing light direction so the eyes look better. This ends up changing eventually. Decided to add a warm light to the side. Also change the background color a little bit. Always good to test different colors, even though I don't end up using these saturated colors. I'm playing with the directional slider on the light to give it more focus, although that means you have to change intensity as well because it comes out too intense. More debugging. I've added a V-Ray pass for the specular and the diffuse, so that way I can swap to it. You can also use the solo mode, as you've seen me use. It's the orange button in the V-Ray buffer, also in the viewport if you're using the V-Ray RT. It lets you solo whatever you have selected. Yeah, I'm now checking one of the V-Ray passes I've added earlier. That lets me check the glossiness. Also alternating between that and the V-Ray isolate mode, which is the orange button up there in the V-Ray frame buffer, to let me see what the texture I'm changing looks like. It can also work with the remap HSV node if you select it. It will show you the result of that color correction, or in this case, value correction. Debugging the gloss a little bit. I end up changing the gloss map in Substance Painter off camera, but that comes later on. I think it was just changing the value difference between the face and the body. They were a little bit off, so I brought them to the same area. Now I'm using a calculator to double the screen resolution, figuring out that math fast, and I'm able to see the details of the face a little bit better without having to zoom in the camera itself. I think I'm going to actually render at this resolution eventually with the Rebus farm. More debugging with the gloss. Trying to get it right. Diffuse color change in the eyes because the whites were popping out too much. Whoa, too intense. Dial it back a little bit. Now with that gloss value, I just changed the displacement amount, and as you can see, the displacement detail altered the gloss. The look of it is now different, even though the value is still the same because there's more detail on the surface. Additionally, I also tweaked the gloss map to make sure it plays well with the details. We're probably never going to get this close in my final renders, but it's good to do just to show. Mixing that detail in there. Now I look at the back view of the character to make sure everything is working, because you don't want to get stuck on one view in the back. Make sure it looks correct from all directions. Like for example here, I noticed the error. One of the meshes was misaligned, so I moved it up a little bit to match the detail, because there's a sculpted detail there. that the stitches fit into. More lighting. I think that's the most repetitive part of it. Because you can't just throw a light in there and call it done. There has to be a lot of tweaking. You're sculpting with the light, kind of. So you make sure the light hits all the right spots and it's not overexposing areas. Also, the highlights of the eyes are really important. So I'm trying to get that in there without actually blowing out the rest of the scene. As you saw there, I toned it back a little bit because it was getting overexposed. Just now I went to the light link editor and I made sure the background isn't affected by all the lights. Only some of the lights are affecting the background now, and I did that with the linking. It's available under Window, Relationship Editor, Light Link Editor. And here I'm doing the same thing on this mesh that was misaligned, so I'm fitting it back to the sculpt detail. Getting some improvement on the lighting in the back view especially. Experimenting a little bit with top lighting, although it was casting too much shadow from the hat. And I didn't want to do some light linking for that because it comes out too artificial. So I want to make sure the character itself doesn't have any light linking, only the background. Now I'm adding a blue rim light to kind of offset a lot of orange that she has. Tweaking a little bit of the scale of some of the props, this one especially. Feels a little bit too small. Deciding on a directional light. Was kind of torn between left and right throughout the process, but I think I ended up with the top right lighting direction with a very blue rim light. Here I was getting a lot of sharpness on her thigh. I think that was due to one of the directional lights. It was causing a lot of sharp shadows there that weren't working too well. I end up replacing the warm directional light with a sphere light, so it has a more softer fall off. Now this is a lighting debug mode that basically shows everything in gray shaded mode, even though we didn't change the materials. It's that button up there, the V-Ray frame buffer. If you hold the isolate button, which is the orange button, it will turn into different options. One of them is the lighting. And now I'm using the V-Ray history to basically write out files, EXRs, temporary EXRs of before and afters. And I'm able to do wipes between A and B, between before and afters. I had realized that the HDRI dome light was adding too much weird colors to the scene, so I color corrected it with an HSV color correct node and made sure in the input max and output max it was set to 10,000 instead of 1. That way it doesn't clamp the HDRI values. So you can just color correct it without clamping the intensity of it. Always good to make sure of doing that. And that input max and output max was in the HSV color correct node. So I was seeing some weird shadow on her shoulder there, so I had to move the light around to basically sculpt that area with the light. Just a little bit slight rotation. And now here I was doing what I was mentioning earlier, which is removing the directional light, the warm directional light I had earlier that was casting that weird sharp shadow, and now replacing it with the softer sphere light. Always tweaking the values, of course, to get it to be like the previous light. Checking all other views, never forgetting about that. And now I'm animating the light because I noticed it looked really bad on other views. The lighting wasn't as good as my main front view. So I animated the lights so that when the camera's moving around her, basically you get sort of the similar lighting. And I was able to basically direct how it will look in all views by the speed of the rotation of the lights. Even independently rotating one of the lights. Now I'm seeing some clipping here, which means two meshes are intersecting, so I had to fix it. Also I need to get that line of shadow. It helps it look like a separate object. Yeah, now I'm adjusting the glossiness, and I think right before this I had went in Substance Painter to tweak the gloss map a little bit. And you see it's just a huge difference, especially on the shoulders there. And I do a quick render, and now I'm making sure that I have the option enabled at the top of the VR frame buffer that renders basically where my mouse moves. So I'm able to move my mouse to key areas and it will render there faster. It's almost like you're painting the render. Now I'm going around and checking key areas to make sure everything is looking correct. Now I'm noticing there's too strong of a rim light on her face. It's the warm rim light. I eventually end up moving that around. Although I'm trying to keep what it looks like on the sword, so that's why I'm checking these areas here. Yeah, adjusting the lights to make sure it doesn't clip, because I noticed at some point it was clipping the sword. One of the lights, I think the sphere light. And right there you saw I moved the light around a little bit so you don't get the sharp orange light on her nose and mouth. So now onto the hair groom. I start by creating what we call scalp meshes, and these are meshes that are floating on top of the actual final render mesh, and they never get rendered. They only carry the hair groom. The rigger would usually warp to form it to the body, so that way it would follow it, and even the expressions it would follow that. So it makes it so much easier because you don't want to actually generate the hairs from the main body, at least for a character like this. If it's a creature, you have to generate it from the whole body. But for characters that have only some hair, not on the entire body, just some spots on their body, it's better to use scalp meshes. And now I go to ZBrush and I bring a temporary mesh just to start generating fiber mesh from. And in the symmetry mode, I enable use posable symmetry, so I'm able to draw masks symmetrically because the topology is identical on both sides. Even though the model is posed, I can still use posable symmetry, which is an option in the transform mode. And I'm generating the fiber mesh for the eyelashes. I could have done this also in XGen from scratch, but I prefer to just start with a fiber mesh because I feel like the brush speed in ZBrush is much faster. It's easier to interact with fibers here, so I start that way and then I edit in XGen, and I'll show you in a little bit here how to convert those fiber meshes into an XGen Groom. So yeah, I get kind of approximately what the flow looks like. Also I import the texture and I assign it, so now I'm able to see where exactly I'm going to paint the mask for the eyebrows, so I can generate the fiber mesh. So yeah, just generate a quick fiber mesh groom here. And then I use the move tool and also the groom brush. And then I comb things around. There's also a lot of the move brush used here, not just the groom brushes. Move brush could be really powerful here, and I feel it's a little bit faster than the action move. So that's why I start here. Always make sure to look up at your model, whether it's in sculpting or grooming, because the eyebrows in this case were a little bit too thick, so I had to look up at them to make sure they're not too thick. And now I am using the same proxy mesh I used earlier to sculpt, and I am drawing on it Zero Mesher guide curves. We're not actually going to be using Zero Mesher here. I'm only going to use those curves to generate tubes. I could be drawing with the tube brush as well, but I feel the Zero Mesher guide curves, it's a little bit faster. You can also erase faster and subtract, remove some of the curves you didn't like you see here. I used the Alt drag horizontally, and I was able to remove some of the curves. I can redraw them much faster without having the geometry. And now I go to the multi-tube brush and I select one of the curves, and then it immediately places a bunch of tubes everywhere where I had Zero Mesher guide curves. So this is a really fast way to generate tubes on the hair. I end up converting these tubes to curves back in Maya so I can plug them back into XGen. You can also do this in Maya if you set this mesh to a live surface, and you can start drawing with the NURBS curves on Maya. You can also get your curves that way, but I feel in ZBrush is much faster. Also I get the option of using separate subtools and move topological to tweak a little bit of the curves much faster than in XGen. And then with that ready, I bring it to Maya. And after I select one edge loop at a time, I go to Modify, Convert Polygon Edges to Curves, and then I go to each curve and I hit G to repeat action, so that way I can immediately generate the curve by repeating the conversion. And And then with that in place, I delete the geo and I'm left with the hair curves. And I go to curves rebuild to add points to them and to make it spaced out. And then I group left and right separately. Now that my curves are rebuilt and they're clean, with just enough amount of points for it not to be heavy. I think I ended up going with 30. And now I'm uncurling the tips at the end because that might cause glitches. I need a underlying structure for the hair, kind of volume, and especially combing it behind the ear. Even though we're probably not going to see that, it's just good to demonstrate. I make separate polygroups for the scalp, left and right, so that way when I generate the fiber mesh from that visible polygroup, it will give it the same polygroup color, so I can select it separately later. And now I'm able to comb the hair back. I'm using some of the Groom brushes like the blow. And also the move tool. Same thing on the other side. I'm able to comb it back. And then eventually I bring those curves back to Maya. I think I bring an approximation of them, not every single curve, because that would be too much. So yeah, now I go to the preview settings in the fiber mesh menu, and I drop the previs button down to something very low, and then I export curves, and I made sure it's in the .ma format, because that's what Maya reads. It's a Maya curves stored in a Maya scene, and ZBrush surprisingly is able to export that as a Maya scene. So yeah, I bring those in here, and now here I'm going to use a really nice script I found online. I'm probably going to post it in the forums or in the description. This script basically sets a pivot point based on the CV, the first point of the curve, which is CV number 0. And whenever you click that, it just sets the pivot point there, which is at the root of the curve. So that way, when I set the scalp mesh as a live surface, similar to what you would do when you're doing retopology, I'm able to select every individual curve and move it around by its pivot point, by its point, but the first CV point, by its root point. So now I'm doing the same thing for the eyebrows. I'm exporting a down-res version as an MA file with the curves. And then rebuilding the curve with the right amount of points. And then I also go to the curves menu, and then I use smooth to kind of soften it so they look like they're not too jaggedy. And right now I set the mesh to live surface, and I'm going around and making sure after I applied that script on those curves that centers the pivot on the first CV point, I'm going around and making sure it snaps directly to the scalp mesh. All you do is select and move it around a little bit, and you'll see it immediately pop back up to match the surface. It snaps to the surface. Also, I'm able to adjust the rotation with a lot of accuracy. If I was to do this in XGen, it would have been you'd have to freeze the hair and make sure it's not brushable, so you're able to focus on one of the hairs. You'd have to keep doing freezing and invert freezing, which is unavoidable at the end, but at least initially when you're trying to stay creative, you'd have more control and immediate control like I have here. So I have a lot of control per guide, per curve, and I'm able to adjust it with a lot of nuance much faster than I would have been able to do it with XGen purely. I'm able to rotate every individual hair and make sure it's aligned exactly how I need it. And those, of course, are the guides. They're not the actual amount of density of the fibers. Eventually, once I put it to XGen, it will be much, much denser. These are just the guides that are going to be driving the Groom, but they're not actually going to be rendered. So yeah, here at the bottom there, I might have done a really bad job at masking to generate those fiber mesh grooves. So now I'm just fixing that, so they're more lined up uniformly and they're not just random. I think I painted the mask a little bit too low on the eyelashes there, the bottom eyelashes. So now instead of repeating all that on the other side, I will just delete the other side, and then I will Basically duplicate the group and then set it to -1 on X, and then freeze transformations after I've moved it into place on the other side. Now I have to go and snap the first CV point to the scalp mesh. There is a bunch of scripts to do this automatically, to snap the first CV point to the mesh, but I'm just showing here what the intention is, which is basically after I get it into place, I make sure it snaps by moving one hair at a time. Also, if you go to the tweak mode in the move tool, it will let you have immediate interaction with the curves without having to actually select them first. So all I'm doing is dragging them around. Also, you can marquee select them still, but you have really fast immediate interaction, much like you would have in ZBrush. You can just click and drag and move the hair around. And make sure to turn off tweak mode after. Now I'm doing some quick scene organization, organizing stuff in groups. So I switched the interface to the XGen interactive mode, which is found under Windows and Workspaces. Now I see the XGen window on the top right and the attribute editor on the bottom right. And I select the scalp mesh, and then I go to create description, and then now it floods the entire mesh with hair. And now I have to add a modifier, which is the guide curves modifier, and then I select all the curves in the scene, and then control click the guides layer, and then you click the use selected curves as guides, and that converts my curves into guides, which are the orange here, and then I hide the curves after. So now I have my curves converted to guides. And now here I create a region map, which I will be needing to define the difference between areas of hair so they don't interact with each other. And make sure you have a Lambert one assigned to that mesh, not any other type of shader, so that way it will let you paint in Maya. If you have any other shader, it won't let you paint. So this map is saved in your project directory, which in this case I made an XGen folder in my project, and I made sure to set my project from the file set project option. And now I'm using the same region map for every function. Usually you'd have to split those in production, but I'm using the same map for to do everything here, which is just the region and the masking. So the light intensity, the value, will define where the hair goes, and the color defines where the regions are. Whenever I want to go to that map, I click the paintbrush icon next to it in the attribute editor, and then it will immediately jump me into the paint mode as long as I have the Lambert 1 material assigned. Now I'm painting the out of bounds fibers, the hairs, because I noticed I was overpainting a little bit too much earlier. I'm making sure the paint is going where the guides are, so the roots of the guides is what I'm painting for. I'm painting for the roots. So XGen will generate hair based on where the paint is, and that hair would be driven by the orange guide curves. So yeah, now I have the region set, and you see the IFF file was created in the background. Every time I save the file, it saves the IFF in the background. Now I make a clump layer, which will group the hairs together so they're clumping. And I will make sure I'm using the same region map I painted earlier, which was accessible through the hypershade, as you saw there. I just drag it from the texture tab, and then I put it wherever I need it. And in this case, I was using it as a density mask and a clump mask and a region mask. Region map, actually. So yeah, I was able to tweak the clump amount to have the hair bunch up and group together. Now I'm removing some of the scalp area that I think was a little bit too extended, and I'm also creating a description for that scalp mesh for the eyebrows. And I'm also generating guides from curves by selecting the curves and then control clicking the guides layer I've created, and then use selected curves as guides. Now I'm using the same region map I've used earlier, which I grabbed from the texture tab. It's already saved, and I'm using it for the region map and the clump masking and the density amount. So based on how intense the brightness is. So that's why I paint with very bright colors. So you can see the region difference, and also it's all very intense. So I'm able to dial in the amount of hair I need in an area. So yeah, right now you see I'm painting where I need the eyebrows hair to be generated, and also painting out the parts where it was generating hair that was far away from the guide curves. I need them to be matching. Now I'm grooming the guide curves with a sculpt layer that I've added, and I click the edit button next to it to let me brush it. And then the Xgen shelf at the top there, you see a lot of really cool tools for grooming. And you see me alternate between them. I use the lengthen and the move the most. And now I'm adding a sculpt layer for the actual hair, not just the guides. So you can control the guides separately, and then you can control the generated hairs themselves with the sculpt layer. And I'm changing the order between the sculpt layer and the clump layer to see what kind of effect I would get. Eventually added the sculpt layer on top of the clumping. So I'm able to sculpt it after the fact. And now I'm alternating the materials between the color material that I'm using, the skin color, the texture, and the Lambert 1. Every time I want to paint something, I assign the Lambert 1 back to the scalp mesh, so Maya would let me actually paint in the IFF file. So now I'm grooming the hairs. Not the guides, but the actual generated hairs. I alternate between the color texture and the Lambert 1 shader so I can paint. And I'm changing the shape of the eyebrows to match the concept a little bit better, because notice it was getting a little bit too thick at the ends there. Also, yeah, assigning Lambert back again, painting out stuff, changing the shape, and then I would go back to the sculpt grooming. And I would use the lengthen brush to shorten stuff around. If you hold control while you're using the lengthen brush, it will unlengthen, it will do the opposite. Adding a clump modifier, and then I'm using the same exact mask I've painted earlier to basically mask the intensity of it. So it goes in the spot where the paint is in the texture. For the sake of speed, that one texture is now controlling a lot of attributes like the region map and the density and the clump mask. So I don't have to paint multiple ones, although it's good if you want to keep it non-destructive to paint different ones. Although different colored map with a lot of bright colors could do the job. Doubles as a region map and as a mask for the clumping. Now I'm adding an actual noise texture in the hypershade there, and using it to control the mask of the clump, so I can have the noise effect appear only in certain spots. And I'm doing this with the noise texture I've created in the hypershade, which is basically done by clicking tab and then writing noise, and you'll get a noise. You can also tile it to be larger or smaller, so you get the effect affecting some of the hairs and not others. So you get the noise and wobbliness happening in some spots. So it's a noise texture driving a noise modifier that's then affecting the groom. Next, I create the groom for the head, and I make sure the CV count is higher than the eyebrows and the eyelashes because I need it to curve more. So I made it 100 CV points just for starters. And then I converted the curves to guides the same way I've used before. Select curves, control click the guide modifier, and then use selected curves as guides. Now I'm using the same map I've used before to define the region map, which is basically a part map for the hair part. But I don't want to paint the whole thing manually, so I select some faces and then I go to the selected faces, flood faces, and I give them both different colors by inverting the selection. And then there's a weird bug here where I have to clear the face selection and then assign the Lambert 1 again in order to access painting back again. So yeah, make sure to assign the Lambert 1 if you ever see any weirdness. Just reset the shader on the scalp mesh. Right here I realized that the map wasn't working for some reason, so I realized that the region map was on, but the region mask was on as well. So I just disabled the region mask and plugged the map I was painting only into the region map. So that way you get the hair part in the middle between the different groups of guides. Also, I've decided to make a different part for the side of the head. So now I'm jumping ahead a little bit where I'm using the clumping to get different effects of the hair. And also something I did off camera is that I realized I needed to split the guides to the bigger guides and smaller guides. So I made 2 guide modifiers and I added different groups of guides to them. So now I have independent control on the bigger chunks of hair and the smaller fiber mesh generated curves that I've made initially in ZBrush. So you see I have 2 guide modifiers in this list right now. Earlier I had been adjusting some of the clump values and the curl values as well to get different kinds of effects and different kinds of hair. Eventually I'll be changing this, and next week I'll be continuing working on this. Always in the clump modifier, make sure the density amount is high enough for you to see different kinds of clumps. So yeah, as you see here, I'm getting a lot of clumps now visible now that I increased the density amount on the clump modifier, which is the number you enter there. Also enabling AO lets you see through the strands a little bit better. This is a viewport accessible option from the top part of the viewport menu there. So now I'm getting something that's a good start. I'm kind of happy with it. Next week I'm actually going to be working on continuing the groom and rendering it. We're going to do look dev on the hair as well, getting the style and the color right. So yeah, stay tuned for next time. Thanks for watching.